Oh, this is quite far from you.
Far away. Hello.
I feel very far from you guys. So
we can hear you.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming by. And this session is about how global VCs are viewing Japanese startups and the ecosystem as a whole, which is still a nascent stage compared to the US and Europe. Despite the fact that the venture funding grew 10 times over the last decade, last 10 years, it's still a fraction, the size is still a fraction of those of the US, less than 1/30 of the US, and less than 1/7 of China. We do rarely see global VCs on the cap table. There are not as many unicorns from Japan yet. So it'll be interesting to learn from them how they are viewing Japanese startups and the ecosystem. And we have experienced investors from US, Europe, and Korea today. And before we jump into the discussion, could we start with our 1-minute self-introduction, starting from Mr. Roos, please?
Well, first of all, Miwa, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. My name is John Roos. My career was in Silicon Valley. For 25 years, I worked at the biggest technology firm in the United States and ran that firm for several years. Our firm represented companies like Google and Apple from when they were 2 people in the garage. Then I had the incredible honor to come here to Japan and be the U.S. ambassador to Japan for President Obama's first administration, the honor of a lifetime. And when I went back to the United States in 2013, I wanted to combine my 2 careers in Silicon Valley and here in Japan. And I started Geodesic Capital, a venture capital fund that is designed to bridge technology between Silicon Valley and Japan.
Michael, please.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here. So I started out as a deep tech entrepreneur in the US, did a spin out of Princeton, sold that company to Fidelity, the largest mutual fund firm on the planet. One of the VCs that had backed me asked me to come and join their investment team in Silicon Valley. It was one of the oldest VCs in the States. Did deep tech investments for them, crossed the Atlantic, did deep tech investments for Advent, very large firm in Europe. Now deploying capital on behalf of family offices, corporates, private equity firms into the deep tech space. Average check size I write is between 10 to 20 million US. Doing investments mostly in North America and Europe, but I have done investments in Asia. And I also sit on the board of the Academic Advisory Board for Deep Tech at University of Oxford. Been on the board of Google's investment fund in Africa. So I've seen some deep tech investments globally. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. Youngsoo, please.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Youngsoo from South Korea. I'm a partner at Crossroad Partners. We are a venture capital and private equity firm based out of Seoul, Korea. And we currently manage around $100 million size of venture capital funds. And we're interested in investing in innovative people, startup ideas. Our portfolios are mainly Korean investments at the moment, but we are trying to expand our investment presence into the global markets. And Japan is our primary focus. So really excited to be here and look forward to having an interesting discussion today.
Excellent. And I'm a moderator, Miwa Seki. I'm one of the founding partners for Empower Partners, along with Kathy Matsui and Yumiko Murakami. Empower Partners is one of the first, probably the first ESG-focused venture capital fund in Japan, and probably one of the first 3 female-led venture capital in Japan, if not the first. I think it's the first. So yes, thank you. So I would first like to ask Mr. John Roos, who was a U.S. ambassador to Japan from 2009 to 2013, a very interesting and historic period for us and probably for you, when the Democratic Party took the majority and then the Tohoku earthquake happened. So the venture ecosystem probably didn't exist back then, and now you are doing this. And do you feel changes in the air? And how do you see the opportunities and challenges?
So it's interesting. When I first came to Japan, because my whole career had been in Silicon Valley, people all over this country were asking me, what's the secret sauce to Silicon Valley? How does Silicon Valley have such an incredible ecosystem? And I ended up giving a speech all over the country that talked about the things that I recommended for Japan, that I was beginning to see the seeds of things like thinking about going global from the very beginning, learning English as a way to compete on the global stage, celebrating entrepreneurs so that young people would be celebrated and those that took the chance, the risk, would be honored as opposed to frowned upon. Diversity, which is something that Empower does very well, but the incredible importance of diversity to succeed. Government support. And I can go on and on, but I talked about the different elements of what it takes to have a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I saw the seeds back then. And quite frankly, I'm excited with how far things have come in the last decade.
So, Michael, you've invested in a Japanese startup before and have seen the developments of the venture ecosystem here. So where do you see the opportunities and challenges of the Japanese startup venture ecosystem?
So just to kind of reiterate something that John said, I think the key challenges now, and you're just starting to see it in the early days, is the awareness that Japanese startups have to be internationally minded from day one and all that entails, right? So that includes having connections abroad, having connections in international markets, whether that be the rest of Asia, whether that be North America, whether that be Europe. Also access to international talent pool, because again, Japan, fantastic domestic talent pool, but it's never enough, right? So you have to be able to access the US market, the European market, et cetera. I'm excited about sort of the future of Japan, especially because I'm a deep tech investor, and I think there's a lot of the right components for Japan to become a powerhouse in sort of the deep tech space, right? Great science and research. I think the key to Japan is going to be figuring out how to unlock that and be able to translate that fantastic science and research into actual commercially viable businesses. But that's something that a lot of countries are struggling with, and I think it's going to take a learning process, and you can start to look at models that they've applied at places like MIT and Stanford. But you combine that with Japan's sort of rich industrial base, the long history of producing really great innovation and technology, and I think the elements are in place for a really good future for the Japanese ecosystem as a place for deep tech startups to start to flourish and to, fingers crossed, go abroad and become global category leaders.
Great. So, Youngsoo, you have not invested in Japan yet, but you are actively looking into it now. But obviously, you know a lot about Japan because you graduated from Waseda, spent some years here. So, how do you see opportunities and challenges?
So, I can start by saying that the venture capital market in Japan is arguably the fastest growing VC market in the world right now. Capital and talents are continuously flowing into Japanese startups. And when we take a look at how and why this is possible, I think it's because of the well-established startup foundation that Japan has. And how I personally view Japanese startup market, what I think a lot of people forget about is that Japan actually has a very, very long and rich history of strong startup DNAs built by great entrepreneurs with successful innovation stories in the global market. So Sony, Panasonic, Hitachi, Toyota, Honda, numbers of companies have shaped today's venture ecosystem in Japan over the decades. So I think Japan has a very solid foundation for ventures to go in the next generation. And that would be in terms of entrepreneurship, experience, technology, data resources, and many others. So there will be a lot of opportunities for venture capitals like us to cooperate with Japanese startups, especially at this stage where government support and corporate capital inflow is active. So I think those are the opportunities that we see here, and maybe the reasons that why we are looking at this startups in Japan and looking for new investment opportunities here.
Excellent. But you've all mentioned, positives of Japanese startups. But what are the negatives? What do you see the challenges are? Mr. Roos, please.
Well, I think there are a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
But if I were to narrow it down to the most important, I would say the necessity to think global, and we've touched on that. You cannot, when I was practicing law, I helped develop the Israeli market. The Israeli model was to start companies, take the technology in Israel, and go to the United States and start those companies in the big market. Again, thinking global from the very beginning. One of the biggest challenges here is you could say it's a positive, negative. It's an incredible country where it's easy to do well in this market without thinking about going outside. But if you're going to have a successful ecosystem, it starts with the global mindset and taking risks. I've said to many Japanese entrepreneurs, go start your company in Silicon Valley and then come back here. It's a tough sell because life is good here. The other big challenge is the cultural challenges that are always hard to overcome, whether it's communication and English speaking, the diversity issue that exists here. And there are many, many issues such as that, none of which are impossible to overcome.
Right. Michael?
Yeah, to reiterate on that, I think the Japanese market, especially if you're talking in terms of how an international investor would view it, it's opaque, and I think a lot of it almost seems deliberately opaque. Just trying to find information on Japanese startups, or coming from a deep tech perspective, Japanese spinouts, or trying to deal with Japanese universities or the administration. There's not a lot. Even going something simple as a lot of investors will look at things like PitchBook or Dealroom, and there's just not a lot of information on Japanese companies. So it goes even beyond just the language barrier. It's almost deliberately opaque, which I think is a shame. I think another thing that's kind of a barrier is one thing that's kind of, I've kind of experienced even the last few days talking with young Japanese entrepreneurs, media, et cetera. In entrepreneurship, you have to be optimistic. And I think that's something that unfortunately is lacking from the Japanese ecosystem. You're as an entrepreneur, it's a hard slog. It's not necessarily the most logical thing to do, but you really believe that you're building the future. And you really believe that you're going to turn nothing into something. And in order to do that, you have to be ambitious, you have to be optimistic, and it would be great to see a bit more of that sort of mindset and positivity in the ecosystem here. There's a lot that, Japan's fourth biggest economy, amazing history, fantastic track record of innovation and invention. There's a lot to be proud of, and I think it's something that should be hit on more. If you're selling a dream when you're an entrepreneur, in order to convince people to come join your company, so it's hard to do that if you're not overly optimistic and being able to sell that dream.
Can I add one thing? And that is, and we've touched on it, but you need to take risks.
Yeah.
You need to take big risks, and you need to accept failure as a part of taking that big risk.
Yeah.
Again, in Silicon Valley, it's a badge of honor to have gone through a failed startup.
Yeah.
In fact, we as venture capitalists, when you're looking at companies, you take that into consideration because they've learned a lot and can grow from there. So that risk aversion is something that needs to be overcome, but is being overcome. I mean, I see young people that I didn't see 10 years ago leaving the big corporations here and going out and starting companies and taking that risk. And it's fantastic to see. And there is incredible innovation. There's incredible technology. One thing we didn't touch upon, there's rule of law, protection of intellectual property that you don't see in many other countries. So there's incredible advantages here. And that's why it's hard for us not to be optimistic about the future.
But I think, and just a quick point, I honestly think, Japan reminds me a bit of the changes that happened in Europe over the last 10 years. I think there's a lot of similarities between sort of how the ecosystem, the startup ecosystem has developed in Europe over the last, say, 10, 15 years and what's kind of happening now in Japan. You know, 10, 15 years ago, if you talk to a young person graduating from a school in Germany, France, whatever, in Germany they would go work for Bosch or Siemens, in France they'd go work for Total or L'Oreal, and I think now entrepreneurship is very much so a top, you could say, career move in Europe, and I think now that seeds are starting to develop in Japan as well. It's just happening a little bit later, but better late than never.
So, Youngsoo, there are actually a lot in common between Japanese and Koreans culturally. Probably risk aversion is one of them. And how do you see that? But Korea has more unicorns than Japan. So how did they overcome that?
I would say, talking about our challenges, I wouldn't say it's a challenge, but maybe room for a change, I would say. Startups need to be very agile, and sometimes, but Japanese corporate culture tend to be a bit conservative, risk averse at times. They prioritize consensus building processes, and the ability to make quick decisions in response to business opportunity is important. And I think those are the points that investors from outside of Japan can support in finding a more efficient way in terms of building organizational structure, corporate culture that really fits for Japanese startups. But on the other end, I think a balanced approach is important rather than a radical change. So gradually introducing new practices while keeping Japanese unique and its own corporate culture norms is important. So I think those are the points that we might want to think about when investing in Japan.
Yeah.
You know, if I can add one other thing, government support. When you asked me what it was like 10 years ago, the government commitment was not there.
Right.
And it is there now. From the Prime Minister to Governor Koike, who's putting on this incredible conference, there's a lot of momentum, and the support of the government is absolutely critical. Everyone always thinks Silicon Valley, technology, everything's done in the private sector, but there is a very big and important government component to the success of ecosystem.
Right. Was that the case in Europe as well? The big government support?
Yeah, you have a huge amount of government support in Europe. I mean, sometimes too much, because you can't really do. I mean, you can't do anything in France without the government. UK, Germany, etc. I think there's always pros and cons. I think you see it's really important for government to kind of step in a slower to develop ecosystem and sort of be a catalyst. So you saw that in the UK initially with David Cameron. You've seen that in France with Emmanuel Macron. And so they can come up with these programs. And there's always a fine sort of line of what can the government do. Because you also want the government not doing too much, because you do need a bit of hunger from the entrepreneurs. There's the issue in Europe is that the governments are actually sometimes taking the place of the private sector, where they're coming in as direct investors, they're coming in as LPs. So you actually get term sheets, competing term sheets with each other, which actually mostly government money on both sides. So essentially the government is just driving up valuations, and you start to get some sort of distortions in the market that way. So it's important to know kind of what the government is doing. But I think what's happening in Japan is similar to kind of what happened in the UK, say 10, 15 years ago, or in France over the last, say, 5 to 7 years. And I think it's going to be positive. You can't, again, going back to Silicon Valley would not exist without the government. I mean, it was driven by the US DoD and the United States Navy. If you look at the history of sort of Silicon Valley,
it still would not exist without the government.
And I'm as a deep tech investor, I think I met with some Japanese government officials yesterday. My first kind of point with them is if you really want to help Japanese deep tech startups, the government should be a buyer of first resort, which is what you see in the United States, right? Whether it's the DoD, whether it's Homeland Security, et cetera. And I think it's something that the government should be able to step in, because whether you're a quantum startup, a photonic startup, something in the semiconductor space, whatever, if you can have those initial clients coming, particularly big, steady contracts from the government, that's going to be super helpful.
What about Korea? The government supported entertainment industry, obviously, and probably tech, and so did that help? Growing, nurturing entrepreneurs in Korea?
So, like Mr. Roos and Mr. Jackson mentioned, government support from capital injection is really important. But also, I think government support in terms of making IPO market venture friendly is also important from an investor point of view. I think Japan is doing well. Also, Korea investment has been putting a lot of effort in making IPO market venture friendly. Introduced a lot of initiatives, having this growth market called COSAC. And I think Japan is also putting a lot of effort in that as well. So from a pure investor point of view, making that IPO market venture friendly is also an important point, I think.
Right. And changing topic a little bit, what areas and spaces would you be interested in if you are to invest in Japanese startups? You mentioned, great technology, great talents, government support, but any, specific areas and spaces are you interested in?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, obviously, I think, looking at the space of robotics, I mean, Japan has a long history in the robotics industry, building up a long track record of IP in that space. I think the next probably 20 years is going to be a very interesting, time period to be in the robotics industry. I think semiconductors, you've obviously got a fantastic sort of industry there. There's, from a geopolitical standpoint, there's also advantages for Japan in that standpoint, as sort of that triangle of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea build up more in the semiconductor space. Space tech, I think you also see a lot of interesting things in Japan for that. AI, I mean, I think it's been touched upon, but I mean, the regulatory environment for AI in Japan is quite attractive, especially comparing it to, say, Europe, where it's become very unattractive for AI. And I think it's good for the Japanese government to keep pursuing that and making sure that there's not much friction points for startups in the deep tech space, particularly AI to go out and to build uninhibited. And so it's where, going back again to the great science, the great research that comes out of here, and again, the trick is going to be being able to turn those into viable businesses that can scale globally.
Yeah, I think those are all areas that I think we're all interested in. If I could add a little color on a couple of them, because Japan is an aging society, there's a lot of technologies, aging and declining population. Yeah. There's a lot of technologies that Japan is moving forward on in the healthcare space, in biotech.
Right.
The whole AI automation, it was interesting as we were hearing more and more about AI. I was seeing in Japan, well, because of the declining population, it's an imperative here, as opposed to in other areas where there is, quote, the threat of job loss.
Yeah.
So there are areas such as that where Japan has, quote, an advantage that I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
Also interested in robotics industry, like Michael mentioned. This is mainly because Japan has been one of the global leaders in robotics industry, especially industrial robotics, for decades, having strong background in manufacturing technology. But also robotics technologies can be applied to a wide range of sectors, including service, healthcare, retail, education, and many, many others. So I think new and innovative technologies will consistently emerge in different kinds of robotic sectors. And that's why we are trying to find next Cyberdyne, next ZMP, next Mujin, technologies that can pioneer in particular sectors in robotics. And that's why we want to find innovative team, innovative companies with leading robotics technology that can really have a big impact in the market.
You know, one thing I just want to point out is the whole China phenomenon and, you know, what's going on with regard to, you can argue whether it's total or partial decoupling. But when I first came back to Silicon Valley in 2013 and started Geodesic, many people said to me, why are you focusing on Japan? The actions in China, that has changed. And now there's just, again, it's the protection of intellectual property, rule of law, the geopolitical issues. That has brought an incredible amount of attention to the Japanese market as an important alternative. And I think that's going to continue to grow.
Yeah, I think it's something that's not brought up enough. I mean, if you're talking about a lot of critically sensitive technologies, you can't have China on the cap table anymore. I mean, I've got portfolio companies where there are Chinese VCs and the governments are saying that has to be cleared off the cap table. So, I mean, Japan is going to be, I think there's a big opportunity for Japan to sort of take advantage of that. So a lot of the money that used to be directed there towards China can now come Japan's way. And I think, look, I mean, especially, again, kind of coming from the deep tech side, I mean, even if you're not interested in geopolitics, geopolitics is interested in you. And there are just, from sovereignty point of view, a lot of technologies which the world has, whether people want to admit it or not, the world has kind of split into two camps. And I think it's a good place for Japan to be in.
And do you find the valuation cheap enough? I mean, with this yen depreciation and
yeah, I mean, if anything, it's you know, there's deals to be had in Japan.
Right.
I mean, I was looking at valuations in Japan versus, I'm not even compared to the US, but even compared to Europe. I mean, Japan is the deals are cheap. There is definitely an arbitrage opportunity there to get in some quality innovation and technologies at a discount, and that's always going to be attractive. The question is, how far down is the yen going to go? And that is going to have an issue because that does impact hiring and you know, going back to sort of internationalization. When you're hiring international talent, if you're paying in yen, that's going to be a problem.
Right. Do you agree with that, Mr. Roos?
Yes,
about the valuation?
I totally agree with
that. Oh, yeah. But how do you think Japan can attract those global talents?
The global what?
Global talents, top talents?
I think immigration policies can help attract global talent. I mean, living in Japan, and I lived here for 4 years, is an incredible experience. I think it would be fairly easy to attract talent to Japan. I think the government has to, you know, again, lend a hand in order to do that. And I keep getting back to diversity too.
Right.
You know, it's interesting. I don't know what the current numbers are, but when I gave that speech around Japan that I was making reference to, I used to talk about the fact that there were 80 different languages spoken in Silicon Valley, and people came from all over the world in order to be there. Diversity of talent, geographic, you know, is just critical to success. And if I can just get back to this theme of globalization, internationalization, if you want a venture capitalist from outside of Japan to invest in your company, one of the critical things they're looking at is this going to grow up to be, quote, a unicorn or whatever? They want to see that they will get in at a reasonable valuation, but the valuation will grow substantially.
Right.
They are looking at returns, and you're not going to get the returns or be able to provide the returns that are necessary to attract that capital unless you internationalize, you think global. And it's, to me, one of the biggest challenges, but can pretty easily be overcome, in my view.
But Korea's done a better job actually startup globalizing and selling to the world. Probably because of the domestic market's a little smaller than Japan. Probably they need to go global. Is there anything that we can learn from Korea on that?
So yes, I think one of the biggest opportunities is scalability, right? Because Japan has a strong domestic market and demand, I think startups can leverage that as a platform, and that makes it relatively easier for them to scale and expand their businesses by going global. And that's a huge advantage for startups in Japan. And I think global VCs, foreign investors, can work as a connecting point for them to enter into the global markets. And I think that's our role when investing in Japan.
Great. So on the flip side of that, what might hold you back from investing in Japan? Any one of you?
Based on my M&A advisory experience in Japanese environment, I see that Japanese companies are put a lot of emphasis on relationship building and establishing credibility when engaging with potential investors. I think that's a very positive point of the market, but that would take a longer period of time for investors to make an investment. So other than culture and language barriers, those are the things that we have to understand before entering Japanese market and make investments in Japanese companies.
Great.
Again, it seems like we're beating a dead horse, but I think one of the biggest obstacles is just, again, the lack of internationalization from some of the teams, right? And so, going back to the point, Japan is still the fourth largest economy. Really attractive, and it gets easy for your Japanese entrepreneur to say, okay, I'm going to build a really good business in Japan, and you can be comfortable. It can be a great lifestyle business, but I think if you're, again, venture capital is a power law driven asset class, so you really need to invest in outliers. So if you're investing in outliers, you're going to have companies that are bigger than their domestic market. So if you're investing in a Japanese company, you better be damn sure that they've got the ability to scale outside of Japan to attract international talent. And that, a lot of the teams just don't have it, right? And so that would be probably the biggest obstacle to investing.
It's to attract international talent. It's getting back to a prior point we've made. Venture capitalists have a responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility, to provide returns to their investors.
Right.
If they're making a decision between, say, a Silicon Valley company and a Japanese company with incredible technology in both, they're going to want to see that where are they going to get the highest returns? And in getting the highest returns, it gets back to conquering the biggest market, which is the world.
Yeah.
And I think that is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the point, the best technology, the best science often doesn't win. It's whoever can scale, can get the clients early, and start building the revenue base, and raising capital sometimes in that early stages. So it's also something that might be counterintuitive to some, but you could have the most amazing Japanese technology, but if nobody's buying it, nobody cares.
But I will get back to another thing we're all saying. There's incredible technology here in Japan.
Right.
I fundamentally believe Japan and the United States are the two most innovative countries in the world. I know people have argued with me on that, but I think you can go down to these different sectors and industries and point to just amazing technology. So if you can address these other issues, it's a significant advantage in my view.
Well, we all agree that Japan has a great, amazing technology. You know, some talents are there, but lacks the scalability or global expansion of the business. How do you think we can fix that? What's the solution to it?
I think one part of the solution is for entrepreneurs to move with support to the I'm biased
US.
because of Silicon Valley.
I agree.
But there are other Silicon Valleys. But, I saw it, as I said, with the Israelis, that they came and opened up in Silicon Valley and grew from there. I saw it with China.
Right.
China sent scores of their talent to the United States and then went back to China. And one of the things that's interesting when I'm talking to Japanese and encourage that, sometimes I get the response, well, they won't come back and we will lose that talent. And there may be a sliver of people that will stay. I'm not saying across the board that won't happen, but by and large, you can have that talent, start these companies, come back,
right,
and that will get, a virtuous cycle going of the ecosystem.
And even if some of those people leave and never come back, that's actually good for Japan.
Yeah.
Because then those companies that stay, that are domestically, will always have contacts and a landing place in Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, London, wherever. And so again, if I was giving advice to sort of a young Japanese entrepreneur or operator, again, go to Silicon Valley even if it's just for a few months. That's going to be better than any MBA or anything else you could ever possibly do. You will learn so much. It is still the epicenter of the startup world, and you're going to learn best practices that it would take you probably a decade here to learn, and you'll be able to do that in 3 to 6 months and build a network that is going to prove invaluable over the long term to you scaling your business, going abroad. Because in reality, Silicon Valley, you can pretty much meet the world's ecosystems, because if you're going out and you spend a few months there, you're going to meet entrepreneurs and operators from UK, France, India, China, you name it. They're all going to be there because it's this gravity well that just attracts talent like nobody else. And I'm not here, trying to, this is obviously an event sponsored by the Japanese government, so I'm not saying, hey, everybody just leave. But it is an incredibly valuable experience that there's no substitute for it. And again, you've seen that in Europe as well, where you had the younger generation who they've all studied abroad, they can speak English, they go to the US or they go even within other countries in Europe, and they come back, they build their networks, and that just raises the bar of every other ecosystem, right? That talent, it's the tide rising all the boats, right? And so I think it's something that should be the focus more for a lot of young or middle-aged or however old you are. You're never too old. So go see what it's like.
Do you see more Korean entrepreneurs moving to the US and start business there, or already, is that happening?
Yes, we see that in Korea. Japan, for Japan's case, the venture capital market in Japan had a somewhat closed nature before. So I think getting support and advice from foreign investors, global VCs in Silicon Valley is really important. And I think it's a great time to be open to foreign investors and inviting global VCs as a shareholder it's a great timing. We talked about the currency. Japanese yen at this point of time is really attractive to foreign investors, and I think it's a very great timing for venture startups to invite global VCs.
Great. So the last question, similar to what we already talked about, but what do you think is required to stimulate venture funding in Japan? The technology is here, talents are here, but
I mean, at the end of the day, as long as you start, if you start building big, ambitious, good globally focused companies, international money is going to find you. That was a reality you saw in Europe, where you did start to see, whether it was Spotify, et cetera, you start to build really good companies that have international potential to scale. The VCs from abroad will find you. I remember when I first moved over from Silicon Valley to Europe, people thought I was absolutely fucking crazy. They were like, why the hell are you going there? This was 15 years ago. There was really no ecosystem to speak of. And now it's multiple big, vibrant ecosystems that are producing a lot of interesting companies. And I think you're going to see similar potential here. And I think it's just focus on that, focus on just rising the quality of the ecosystem here. And again, it's going to happen.
Mr. Roos?
Yeah, no, I agree. If I could pivot a little bit to, we've talked about the younger generation, what they should be doing. The older generation, and I think I touched upon this a little bit, should be celebrating entrepreneurism and entrepreneurs. One of the things that I saw throughout my career is there were just, and still, incredible role models. Everyone wanted to grow up to be Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
And, many other role models. And there have been great role models here in Japan. But I think consistently celebrating and pointing out these success stories and pointing out that it's good for Japan, for people to take these chances to start these companies. I think that would be very...
Do you think it's gradually happening? Mikitani-san's there, Son-san's there.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important not to get... It takes a long time to build a solid ecosystem, right? I mean, there's an old saying, it takes about 20 years to build a startup ecosystem. And so there's going to be year-to-year fluctuations. That's going to happen. But I think, it's not going to happen overnight, and you just have to be aware of that. And that's nothing to be discouraged by. You just have to stay optimistic and keep pushing through. And I think, I think Japan is on the way of having a much more vibrant ecosystem.
I think I can tell you from a Korean VC point of view. As you know, Korea and Japan are geographically very close to each other. But despite the proximity, the investment activity between the two countries hasn't been that active for many reasons. But recently, Korean VCs actively set out to study and enter Japanese VC market. And the level of this venture investment activity is unprecedented. And I think it's going to be much more active in the coming years. And I think that what's stimulating that is the venture-friendly IPO market that I talked about, the currency and the scalability that the venture startups in Japan has. So I think those are the points that what's stimulating Japanese startups and inviting global VCs in Japan.
Great. So, Mr. Roos, any advice to Japanese entrepreneurs?
I've already...
For them to get money from you?
No, I think we've touched on it. I mean, my advice is go out, start companies, take chances. Don't be afraid of failure. It's a learning experience. Think globally. Make think about mobility of talents, shifting around, grabbing the best talent from wherever it is. Diversity, all of those things are incredibly, incredibly important to a vibrant system. One thing we haven't touched upon is things like this are great. Networking, when you go out to a restaurant in Palo Alto, California, and you listen to, I shouldn't do this, but you listen to the conversations at the tables around you, they're all talking about their companies, and they're talking about what advice can you give me to succeed. That's part of the network. Part of the network is also universities. And, I'm biased, I went to Stanford, but the number of students that are computer science majors that are already talking about starting companies and have started companies is incredible. But the university, by the way, and the universities here are beginning to, but need to further support that system. So that young people that develop technology, have ideas for companies, can go out and start the companies and have the rights to the intellectual property and the upside, even if the university can, quote, share in some of that. So there's, all of these are components that, you know, as we've been talking about, add up to a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Excellent. So that concludes the session. Thanks for listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A big round of applause to all of our speakers, please. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.